The ridge sat quiet beneath the fading light. Shrubs cast long shadows across the earth, and the breeze tugged gently at the grass where the slope turned downward, toward the base of the valley. At this time of day, most of the trails emptied. Even the birds seemed to grow still, the air growing heavier with the promise of night. That was when Paulo saw the shape. He'd been scanning the ridgeline, walking his usual route before descending back to camp. A figure lay in the tall grass near a bend in the trail, a man, unmoving, legs curled slightly, one boot half off. 20 feet away, a dog stood rigid, not pacing, not barking, just still. The dog was medium built, coarse-haired, tail stiff, ears forward. Its body didn't sway. It didn't lower its head to sniff or relax into a resting position. It simply stood, locked in place above the body, like it was waiting that Paulo stepped forward slowly. The man's skin was pale, sallow in the light. There was a dryness around the mouth, and his hands were curled into the grass like he tried to hold on to something before letting go. His chest still moved. The dog didn't growl, didn't retreat. It shifted its eyes to Paulo but didn't leave its place beside the man. The position was protective, not aggressive. Paulo crouched slowly, keeping his voice low. Easy, he murmured. Not gonna hurt him. The dog's muscles didn't relax, but it didn't move to block him. Paulo laid the fingers on the man's neck. The pulse was there, but slow. Breathing was shallow. His skin felt warm, almost too warm. Not sunburned, something internal. As he studied the man's ankle, Paulo saw the swelling. The dark punctures, red around the edges, had spread into a bloom of discoloration. The area around it pulsed faintly with the man's heartbeat. That snake bite. The dog had stayed. There were no water bottles, no phone nearby, no visible signs of gear or a pack. Just the man, the grass, the dust, and this lone animal standing sentinel as if it had made a decision and stayed with it. Paulo stepped back slightly and radioed in. He kept his voice calm, giving location, suspected cause, status of the man's vitals. There'd be no airlift up here tonight. The light was too far gone. They would need to stabilize him on site and carry him down by stretcher if necessary. He opened his pack and pulled out water, soaked a cloth, pressed it lightly to the man's forehead. The dog finally moved, one step forward, head dipping slightly, eyes focused on the cloth. Not aggressive, curious, watching. The dog's coat was dusty, ribs just slightly visible under the fur, but it didn't look feral. It looked tired. Paulo sat beside the man and dog for several minutes. No sudden movements, just waiting. Every few seconds, the dog would glance down at the man, then back to Paulo, then out toward the open slope, as if guarding 3 directions at once. The quiet stretch. If Paulo moved too fast, the dog might run. If the dog ran, the man would be left alone again. And if Paulo left to get help, the risk of exposure or worsening symptoms rose sharply. If he waited too long, the venom would travel deeper. The dog lay down, not fully, just settled on its haunches, keeping one front paw pressed to the man's side. The gesture was small, but it was enough. Paulo unpacked the thermal blanket and gently slid it under the man's back, rolling him slightly, never rushing. The dog gave a low sound, not a growl, more a breath held in its throat, but it didn't intervene. Almost done, Paulo whispered. Darkness crept closer. The dog's eyes glowed faintly in the coming shade. Paulo couldn't name the breed. It didn't matter. It was here. It had stayed. The air cooled. Night insects stirred in the brush. Paulo looked down at the man again, still breathing, still warm. The dog didn't sleep, just watched. In that dimming light, the ridge held 3 living things in the strange, still balance. A man on the edge of danger, a ranger with steady hands, and a dog that hadn't left his side. If the pulse held through the night, there'd be a chance. But only if nothing changed. Only if no one panicked. Only if the stillness held. The dog blinked, then pressed its head gently into the man's chest, a slow, quiet motion. Paulo folded his arms over his knees and waited beside them, the last light of the sun barely touching the ridge as it fell behind the valley. Paulo stayed crouched beside the man, the light nearly gone now. The sun had slipped beneath the far hills, and the warmth that had clung to the earth all afternoon began to fade with it. The ridge line, once golden, had dulled to a muted gray. The dog hadn't moved far. He stood now, just beside Paulo, chest heaving softly, ears angled slightly back. His paws were coated with the same dust that coated the man's pants. Paulo leaned closer to the leg again, shining his torch low across the ankle. The swelling had worsened. The 2 puncture wounds were clean, spaced just far enough apart, a textbook strike. Likely a puff adder, wide-headed, heavy-bodied. They didn't always hiss before they struck. The flesh around the bite had started to discolor, a faint spread of purplish red, beginning to move up toward the calf. The foot twitched once, then stilled. The man groaned, barely audible, just a breath of pain beneath unconsciousness. Paulo unrolled his field kit and tied a soft bandage loosely above the wound. Not tight enough to cut circulation, just to slow the venom spread. The dog edged closer again, sniffed the man's boot, and let out a quiet, almost frustrated sound. Not a bark, just breath pushed through the nose. That's when Paulo understood. The man hadn't collapsed recently. The dog had been here for some time, long enough to know no one was coming, and when the hours passed, he must have gone looking. The only reason Paulo had found them was because of the noise. Not frantic barking, but a steady, rhythmic call. Not panic, but persistence. He hadn't recognized it then, but now it made sense. The dog had stayed, but he also called. The moment lingered between them. Man, dog, ranger. Paulo reached into his canteen and wet a cloth again, wiping the man's brow, watching for any change. The breathing remained shallow, but consistent. The pulse, when checked again, was still faint but holding. If it dropped further, there wouldn't be time to wait. He turned his attention to the dog. No collar, no tags, just a rough loop of twine knotted around the neck, worn down from weather and time. Possibly once tethered, possibly once kept now. Now he was something else. The dog sat again, this time letting his flank brush lightly against the man's arm. Paulo watched the way the muscles stayed alert, never fully relaxed. The body stayed between the man and the open path. There was something deeply rooted in the gesture, not just memory, not just instinct. Paulo kept his movements slow. He opened a foil packet from his bag and slid a small strip of dried meat onto the ground near the dog. It was a test, and also a peace offering. The dog waited a full 30 seconds before sniffing it. He didn't eat it, just placed a paw on it and kept his eyes forward. That was enough. If Paulo had tried to lift the man alone, the dog might have stopped him. But now, there was something between them, an understanding. He radioed again, this time requesting the field stretcher and backup from the base. It would take time, 4 to 5 minutes if they moved fast. Venom stable for now, he said quietly into the radio. Dog still guarding. He kept the man elevated slightly, adjusting the blanket again. The wind had picked up. The dog shifted closer. The stars had begun to show above them, soft points in the growing dark. It was a strange scene, one Paulo wouldn't forget. A man saved not by luck or timing, but by an animal's refusal to leave. The stakes remained unchanged. If the venom moved faster than help could arrive, there was little anyone could do. But there was a difference now. The man wasn't alone. The dog leaned down and licked the man's cheek once, not hurried, not repeated, Just once. Then he returned to his watch. Paulo whispered, "You called us, didn't you?" The dog didn't respond, just blinked slowly, the edge of his body touching the man's again. The moon rose faintly behind the ridge. The dog had done all he could. Now it was Paulo's turn to wait. The post held. The man's chest moved, and the dog never stepped away. The signal failed just after dark. Paulo tried twice more to raise the outpost, but the ridge blocked what little strength remained in the radio. Static hummed back, then nothing. He clipped the receiver to his belt and leaned back on his heels. They were alone now, in every way that mattered. The man hadn't stirred again. His chest still rose, but slowly, with long pauses between breaths. The pulse in his neck fluttered like something unsure of its rhythm. Paulo checked it again, counting silently. It was there, but weaker than before. If it dropped further, it wouldn't hold through the night. The temperature fell as the last warmth left the rocks. Grass curled under the wind. Small insects began to hum beneath the brush, quiet rhythms of the land settling into evening. The dog hadn't moved far. He sat with his front paws close together, eyes tracking Paulo's hands every time they shifted near the man's chest or ankle. Not suspicious, just alert, like something that had stayed vigilant long past the point of fatigue. Eventually, he stood. He stepped toward the man's face and licked him once, just above the temple. A slow pass of the tongue, no urgency. Then he placed one paw lightly over the man's chest and held it there. Paulo didn't speak. He just watched. The dog's breathing was steady. He kept the weight of that paw against the man's shirt, not pressing, just present. The rise and fall of the man's chest nudged the paw slightly each time, a gentle confirmation that life still moved beneath it. Minutes passed like that. No signal, no voices, just the rhythm between two bodies, one fading, one holding ground. The dog lay down fully then, curling lightly around the man's side, his nose pressed into the crook of the man's neck. Paulo lit the edge of a small heat pack and tucked it beneath the blanket, just enough to keep the man's core warm. If the body cooled, the venom was slow, but so would the organs. A balance had to be kept between fever and collapse. He marked the time by the stars. The way the wind shifted slightly toward the west every 15 minutes, he checked the pulse. It remained weak, but the silence around them was complete, but never empty. In the distance, a nadir called once. A rustle of something small passed through the lower grass. The dog never flinched. He didn't sleep. He simply stayed close, head rising slightly every time the man groaned or shifted faintly under the weight of the blanket. At one point, the man whispered something. The sound was broken, lost in the rasp of dry breath. But the dog's ears twitched. He moved again, licking the man's cheek. This time, he gave a soft, low whine, barely audible. Paulo leaned in closer, hand hovering above the man's chest. Still breathing, still warm. The dog placed his paw on him again. Same position, same weight. If the pulse faded, he would feel it first. That thought settled deep in Paulo's chest. It wasn't just the dog's loyalty. It was the timing, the restraint, the way he had not left when instinct may have told him to seek shelter, food, or water. He had stayed when there was no reason to stay. And now, he monitored life with the quiet precision of something ancient and sure. The pulse fluttered again beneath Paulo's fingers. He exhaled. Still here. If the night held steady, if the venom didn't move faster with the drop in temperature, there was still time. He took a small cloth, dampened it with the last of the clean water, and pressed it gently to the man's lips. A faint reflex met him, the swallow weak, but present. The dog shifted slightly, allowing the space, then returned to his place. The weight of his presence never wavered. Hours passed like that, quietly, without incident. but with no promise that each minute stretched across the ridge like a drawn thread. No rescue yet, no signal. Only the wind, the grass, and the sound of one dog breathing beside the man he refused to leave. If the pulse faded, he would know before Paulo did, and he would stay. Even then, the fire was small, just enough to push back the cold. Paulo kept it low, feeding it in careful intervals, shielding the light with a ring of stones. Sparks rose and faded quickly into the dark. He sat close, but not too close, always watching the man, watching the dog. The ridge had gone quiet long ago. No footsteps, no voices, no sign of the team below. The radio remained silent. They were hours into night now, and the man's breath still came soft and unsteady. But he was not alone. The dog had curled against him fully now, chest pressed to the man's side, one hind leg stretched across the blanket. His body created a seal, holding warmth where the human body was too weak to do it alone. Paulo had wrapped another layer over them both. Not tight, just draped in a way that kept the heat in. The dog hadn't resisted. He hadn't even flinched. Once every half hour, Paulo offered water, pressing a small cloth to the man's lips, moistening the corners of his mouth. It wasn't enough to hydrate, but it was something. The man stirred occasionally, groaning low in the throat. Not words, just fragments of awareness. Each time, the dog would lift his head, nose close to the man's face, eyes alert. And each time, he would lower it again when the sound passed that it was the rhythm Paulo noticed next. As the fire flickered and the moon arched higher, the dog's chest rose and fell, steady, even. And then, so did the man's, not in exact timing, but in a pattern that became hard to ignore. The dog inhaled. A beat later, the man did too. The dog shifted his head. A breath after, the man's chest would move that it was as if the dog's breath was a signal. And the man's fading body followed it that Paulo leaned in, watching more closely now. The dog's side moved with each breath, slow, grounded. The man's breath followed, still shallow, still labored, but consistent now that it wasn't science. But it wasn't nothing either that sometimes, on long nights like this, Paulo had seen things he couldn't explain. Not miracles, just spawns, just choices made without words, by creatures who didn't need language to know when to stay. The fire cracked softly. The dog blinked, lifted his head once, and looked at Paulo, not seeking approval. Just checking. You're doing good, Paulo whispered. He added a bit more wood to the fire. Checked the dressing on the man's ankle. The swelling had not moved higher, and that was something. The venom had either slowed or settled. He couldn't know for sure, but the pulse held, still low, still weak. But there, he sat back, letting the firelight touch the edges of his face. The dog had lowered his head again, nose resting in the crook of the man's neck. His eyes fluttered, but he didn't sleep that, and then, without warning, without sound, the man stirred. Not a twitch this time, not just a groan. His hand moved, the one near the dog's leg. Fingers curled slowly against the fur. No grip, no pressure. Just contact me. Paulo watched as the dog shifted in response, nudging his head lightly against the man's cheek. The man exhaled a rough breath, deeper than any before, still not conscious, but closer. The firelight danced in their shared breath, thin wisps rising in tandem. Paulo leaned forward. Keep going, he said softly. Just a little more. The dog didn't look at him, didn't move. He stayed exactly where he was, pressed tight to the man's ribs, sharing warmth, sharing rhythm, whatever thread had kept the man tethered to breath, to body, to time. The dog had held it through the night, and now, at last, something shifted. Not enough to rise, not enough to speak, but enough to stay alive. Paulo sat back and let the moment pass without words. The fire was steady now. The cold no longer felt sharp, and somewhere far down the slope, a faint echo of movement stirred. Help was coming, but up here, it was the dog who had kept the pulse. The dog who didn't leave. The first light came pale and thin, brushing against the dry grass with a quiet, colorless glow. The sky hadn't yet turned, but the edges of the darkness began to lift, like breath on glass. Night gave way slowly on the ridge, and with it came change. Paulo hadn't slept. He had dozed for minutes at a time, legs drawn beneath him, jacket pulled close. He'd kept one eye on the fire and the other on the dog, who remained curled at the man's side, unmoving through the coldest hours. Now, just before dawn, the dog lifted his head. He didn't make a sound. He simply rose, slow and stiff, stretching each limb as if reluctant to put distance between himself and the man. The dog took a few steps forward, then turned back, standing square over the man's body with his chest out, tail still. The man stirred. First it was just a shift of breath, deeper, less strain. Then a cough, dry and low, broke the quiet. Paulo was already kneeling at his side, fingers finding the pulse at the neck again. It was stronger, still fast, but no longer fluttering. The man's eyes opened slowly, unfocused. He blinked, winced at the light, and moved his hand to his face. The motion was clumsy, uncoordinated, but it was as Paulo leaned in. Don't move too fast. You've been out most of the night. Snake bite. The man swallowed hard. His lips cracked. He tried to speak, but only managed to sound something like a name, maybe a question. Paulo brought the canteen and dripped water onto his lips, letting it soak in. The man drank, barely, then turned his head slightly toward the figure beside him. The dog stepped closer. He stood with one paw beside the man's ribs, the other just above his arm, tail low but not tucked. The stance was protective, but calm, the same posture he'd held all night. His ears twitched as the man breathed out again, this time shaping a few rough syllables. Benji. He rasped, "Is that you?" The dog blinked once. Then he leaned in and touched his nose to the man's cheek. Paulo watched in silence. The man's hand rose shakily and found the coarse fur behind the dog's ear. It wasn't a firm grip, more recognition, a confirmation of presence. The two stayed like that for a moment. Then the dog stepped away. He turned toward the bush just behind them, a low, scraggly plant with dry leaves and dust caked at its roots. The dog lowered his head and began nosing through it. His movements were deliberate, slow, not looking for food, not curious. He knew what was there. Paulo rose and stepped closer as the dog pushed aside a patch of leaves and pulled out a thin object. Tied with twine, it had been tucked under a flat stone, hidden from view. The dog gripped it gently in his teeth and carried it back to the man, setting it down beside his hand. It was a photograph, weather worn, edges curled, but intact. The image had blurred slightly with time and moisture, but the figures remained clear. The man, younger, holding a dog against his chest. The same shape, the same eyes. Paulo crouched again. "You knew him," he said quietly. "You've been looking." The man nodded weakly, eyes locked on the photograph. He closed his fingers around it and held it to his chest. "He was taken in the floods," he said, voice breaking. "A year ago, I looked every trail. Couldn't find him." Paulo didn't answer. He looked at the dog, who now sat beside them once more, tail curled around his side. It explained the twine around the neck, the way he had it run from humans, the way he guarded the man with more than instinct, with memory. He had known, and when the man collapsed, he had waited. And when no one came, he called. Until someone did. The ridge brightened. The sky turned silver blue, the edges of the valley below rising out of shadow. A bird called somewhere down the slope, and a breeze lifted the ash from the edge of the fire. The dog lay down again, resting his head near the man's chest. There was no sound between them, just the breath of two lives held close, and something too quiet for words that far below. Movement stirred. Two figures began to climb toward them, a medic and another ranger, coming with supplies and a stretcher. But for now, Paulo didn't move. He let the sun touch the edge of the blanket, let the dog keep his place, let the photograph lie between them like proof of something too quiet, too patient to name. The man closed his eyes again, this time not from weakness, but rest, and the dog didn't move. The stretcher came with the morning sun, rising slowly across the ridge and filling the valley with light that felt softer than the night had promised. The wind shifted, lifting dust from the path as Paulo stood to meet the two figures making their way up from below. One carrying a folded canvas stretcher, the other with a first aid satchel against his hip. They moved quickly, but not with panic. Paulo raised one hand in silent acknowledgement, then turned back to where the man still lay, half propped now with his back resting against the low pack. The dog hadn't left his side. He lay beside him, chest rising steady, ears flicking now and then with the sound of steps. His eyes stayed fixed on the man, not Paulo, not the rescuers, just him. The man had grown stronger in the last hour. Color slowly returned to his skin, and though his breath still came rough, it no longer shook. When the medic knelt beside him and began unwrapping the bandage on his ankle, he didn't flinch. "You're lucky," the medic said. "Most don't make it through the night on a bite like this, especially not without antivenom." The man blinked slowly and turned his head toward Paulo. His voice came rough but steady. "I didn't make it through alone." He reached out and laid a hand gently on the dog's head. "Benji," he said again, clearer this time. "He's the one that stayed." The medic paused, glancing at Paulo, then back to the dog. "I thought he was gone," the man said. "Flood came through our side of the valley last year, took the whole shed down. The gate split in half. I tried to find him for weeks after nothing. I thought he was dead." He ran a slow hand over the dog's back. The fur was tangled in places, worn thin near the shoulder. Not feral, but aged by something rougher than a yard. "He must have kept moving," he said. "Survived out here. Found trails I never could have followed. Maybe he went looking too." Paulo didn't speak. He knelt beside them both and watched as the man leaned his head back, eyes closed against the light. "I came up here 2 days ago," he said. "Not for anything. I just needed to walk. Didn't know he'd still remember me." But he had. The dog had remembered more than scent, more than voice. He had remembered enough to stay when the man fell. "I remembered how to wait. I remembered what it meant to guard." The medic finished with the bandage, applied a shot to ease the venom's effect, then signaled to the second ranger to unfold the stretcher. The dog stood. He didn't bark, didn't growl, but he placed himself in front of the man's legs and lowered his head. Ears tipped back, body still. A barrier that Paulo stepped forward. "It's okay," he said gently. "They're just going to lift him. He'll be okay now." The dog didn't move at first. Then he turned, looked once at the man, then back at Paulo. The man reached forward, fingers grazing the dog's ear. "Go with him," he whispered. "I'm coming to." The dog stepped back. They lifted the man carefully. The stretcher bowed slightly beneath his weight but held firm. His hands clutched the photograph, still tied with twine, still smudged at the edges. He kept it against his chest. The dog walked beside them as they descended, close but not underfoot. His pace matched the stretcher. His gaze stayed forward. When they reached the base of the hill, The sun had fully risen. The grass swayed in long golden arcs. The trees stood still as if listening. They reached the ranger truck parked near the trail's mouth. Paulo opened the back door, and the stretcher was lifted gently inside. The man coughed once, winced, then turned his head toward Paulo. "Thank you," he said softly. "But it was Benji. He found me first." Paulo nodded. "He didn't just find you. He called us too." The man smiled faintly. "He always knew the way home." Paulo looked at the dog, who stood beside the open door, tail flicking once in the dust. "You're getting in," he asked. Benji stepped forward and leapt up lightly into the cab. Settling beside the stretcher without hesitation, he laid down again, nose near the man's shoulder. The photo still rested between them. The truck pulled away slowly, tires crunching the gravel, leaving behind a ridge where silence had once settled in for the night. In its place was something else, not noise, not celebration, just breathe, just presence, and a dog who remembered.